Oh, shalom, my friends. Shalom, my enemies. This is your old pal, Rabbi Sol Solomon, the founder and spiritual leader of Temple Sons of Bitches in Great Neck, New York. And oh, I am so delighted to have with us in the neighborhood this fine morning. Come on, I admitted you. Where are you? Come on in. There we go. It's going to be an actress, a writer, a playwright, a consultant, and also a woman who's had, shall we say, quite a lot of different jobs. In fact, she even did a one-woman show about it called Lessons Learned from Jobs I Can Never Put on My Resume. So she did that. She also, she did a show, an autobiographical show called 7.5 Habits of Highly Effective Mistresses. Think about naughty there. But now she's doing a show devoted to a guy who did some naughty stuff, but he also made some wonderful music. A guy named George Gershwin. Nice Jewish boy. Of course, I think can you say, I want to make sure you're not muted.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes.
It works.
Lisa.
Hello, Dave.
No, this is Rabbi Salsa. Can you tell
me? Hello, Rabbi Salsnik.
Yeah. There we go. Let me just get my yarmulke straight here. All right, so...
oh, no.
So, welcome to Lisa Faith Phillips, whose show, Let's Do It Again, Songs and Love Affairs of George Gershwin, is playing at the Club Pangea on October 26th. That's next Shabbos, a week from today, at 7 o'clock in the evening over on 2nd Avenue. So, welcome, first of all. Good Shabbos to you, Lisa.
Good Shabbos to you,
now,
Rabbi.
There you go. Rabbi or Your Eminence, either one.
Your Eminence.
So, you don't seem Jewish. You're not, are you?
No. I'm a former pilgrim ancestry.
Wait. Well, no. If your ancestry is your ancestry, you're not former.
Pilgrim ancestry.
Can you really? How far can you trace your humans back?
The Mayflower.
Really, you've done that. You can literally.
Yeah. So, and daughter of the American Revolution. You know, we have a.
Yeah. Really? No, do tell. This is not a one-sentence answer. I mean, it's like, how really? You know what? Who was on the Mayflower?
Yes, it's fascinating. My sister's very into, going back and finding all the ancestors, and we were very close with our grandparents and our great-grandparents, and above that lived in Brooklyn Heights. Our great-grandfather went to Harvard Law School and had a law firm in Brooklyn Heights, but also had a house up in Popham and Beach, Bath, Maine. And we went up there to do some exploring, and his great-grandfather ran a big shipping building company. They would do whalers, and there's a fascinating maritime museum up there where the great-great-grandfather's desk sits there in the museum, and fascinating history of early shipbuilding in the United States.
Wow, so I guess you can go take a ship for yourself. Ladies and gentlemen, there's a little comedy there. But you went in you didn't go to Harvard. Right, but what direction did you go?
Well, my parents met. My mother was from New York, but my father was from a small town in Ohio, Findlay, Ohio. So they met when my dad was in the Air Force, fell in love. And so I was raised in a great small town, Findlay, Ohio. And it was a wonderful place. Interestingly, it became a test site for cable television, which had a big influence on me. So I grew up watching all the great old musicals, the MGM musicals, and I would spend my Saturdays singing and dancing with Fred Astaire and Ginger Rogers. And I think that's, carried through in my whole life, the joy of that music from those great musicals, which has brought me to these great cabaret about George Gershwin, and we're also doing one about Cole Porter, and then next Irving Berlin.
Oh, there you go. Keep the Jews coming. Porter, keep the kids coming. William Finn, Stephen Sondheim, Frank Leslie.
Rogers and Hart will be after that.
There you go. And Lerner and Lowe, and all these wonderful.
Harold Arlen.
Yes, Stephen Schwartz.
But then I went off to, I was lucky to get to go to Wellesley College in the suburbs of Wellesley and do my junior year in Paris, which really opened up my small town eyes to travel and the joy of learning another language. And
Tell us the story of being a teenager in Paris, please.
Oh, it was just heaven. I mean, when I arrived there, although I'd studied French in high school and a little bit in college, when you study French in the Middle West, you're not even expect to speak it. So when I got there, my French was not great, so I had to learn a lot. But I loved going out and I loved dancing, so I was often going out dancing in the jazz clubs. And then they had there was a revival there in the Rue de la Huchette, where they had this great jazz club where you could go and dance the jitterbug, and that had sort of made a big comeback in Paris, which was super fun. And I did fall in love quite a few times. And I find this so wonderful when you're in a different language. You can't really prejudge people. So in a way, I was more open and met some fascinating people. And nothing like learning French by having a French boyfriend.
How long were you? Only a year? You had several
Only a
boyfriends?
year, but I loved it so much, and I realized studying abroad was, I joke, a great scam. You sound serious, but you spend your days sitting in cafes drinking wine. So I then went to the London School of Economics for graduate school, a master's in economics. And that was a little more demanding, but still great to live in London, meet people from all over the world. And then I had so much fun, I thought, well, let me stay abroad for a while because I thought, well, if I come back, then you'll get a job and it'll be hard to leave. So I moved to Barcelona thinking I'd stay just for a year and learn Spanish and teach English. It was very easy to teach English then, but it was so much fun. I stayed for 3 years.
What a life! My God! And all the while you stayed abroad because you didn't have a sex change and turn into a guy. Now, so tell me a story of Spain. Did you fall in love with Spanish men? And
Oh, yes, that was wonderful. The Spanish music and the poetry is just so beautiful. So I did pretty quickly. When you get there in Barcelona, everyone who's, sort of in the business world is speaking Catalan. There was a real resurgence of the emphasis to speak Catalan. So I did learn some Catalan, but I quickly sort of migrated to being with people from Madrid or South America so I could speak Castellano, as they call it over there, but we would just call it Spanish. And so it was a great way to, meet again a lot of people. Teaching English was also a great way to meet some fascinating people. But I pretty quickly fell in love actually with a Jewish man from Argentina. And he had done studies in Paris and had lived in Israel for a while, but he had come to Barcelona. And we were very serious and talked about getting married. But I was ready to come back to the United States. So a few months later, he followed me over, but he didn't speak English. And very quickly, it was kind of hard for him. I was going out already, very engaged. And I was lucky to get an apartment in the East Village. So I had this very lively, fun comedy, social life. I was doing stand-up comedy then. And so we didn't stay together, but we're still friends. He's back in Barcelona, married a very nice Catalan.
so the closest I get to that is when I go to a place, a party that has vegetarian cuisine. I say, give me the grill. Give me the grill. Let me get some steaks from Wegmans, and I'll put the cattle on. Yeah. Went a long way for that joke, didn't I? Okay, so fine. So at this point, then you're in the East Village. You got the New York boho life going on, right? And then
Yes.
what kind of stuff were you doing? The Comedy Cellar? Where were you appearing? And what
You
was?
know, it was interesting. I did a lot when I first got here. I first did sort of the downtown scene, the performance art. There were places like, well, Folk City, we could do stand up. I went to Cornelia Street Cafe right away and I did a lot of shows there. That was such a great environment. Open for 45 years. They did 2 shows a day. It was incredible. But they did close in 2019 in the West Village. And I found I got involved in a comedy theater, Manhattan Punchline, which was up on 42nd Street, where we could do plays. We did, music comedy plays, but they were so encouraging, and we had comedy classes. Then I went to the comic strip and I auditioned, and it was so exciting because the first time I did really well. It was one of those times where the comedy really clicked and the audience liked me. And that same night, I remember they said, "We want to introduce a new comedian who's friends with Eddie Murphy, Chris Rock." He did quite well.
Yeah.
Um, But
Wow.
then that night, the MC said, "Oh, I'm sorry, the man who passed the talent had to leave. Can you come back next week and do it again?" So I was like, "Oh, disappointing," just because it was so special that night. It sort of really clicked. But I came back the following week, and of course, it wasn't quite the same. It was rainy and windy, and not as much of an audience. But I got up and I did my same set, which I would read the paper and do more political or topical comedy. It wasn't so much like dating. And so after the guy said, "Oh, well, the guy who passes his talent wants to talk to you, so stay and wait." And people were leaving, and I was waiting. I see him talking to others in this booth, and finally it's my turn. And I go over, and he says, "Well, I really liked your material, but it's hard for women because men don't find women funny. And you came out looking very attractive." I was wearing a red dress. I was trying to figure out my look, with long red blonde hair. He said, "But now coming out looking so attractive, the men are going to want you, and the women in the audience will be jealous of you." And I'm like, "Oh dear, this man seems to have some issues." And he went on about how all the casting agents in New York are men, and they don't find women funny. And I'm like, my head's sort of throbbing, and I'm just trying to smile and be agreeable, small town
Well,
girl.
it's trying to give you
And
the Jerry Lewis advice, whether it's
yeah.
he's trying to tell you what was what back then.
And then he tells me, and everyone's leaving. The bartender's locking up. He keeps me there talking, and everyone's gone. And then he says, "Well, I want you to know I'm suffering from blue balls." And I was like, "What?" I had heard that once in high school, but I hadn't actually ever been confronted with it. So I was so surprised, and I thought, "Wow, this is the casting knee pads that you heard about, the casting couch." And I thought to myself, I give a fabulous blowjob, but I could not give a blowjob to someone who did not find women funny. So I just could not do it. So I just pretended like I didn't hear him. I said, "Oh, I gotta go." He said, "Well, you can come back and get up at 11 o'clock and work on your material." But I didn't go back. I didn't
Didn't work
feel
out.
comfortable.
Do you want to name names? Do you remember names?
Anyone who knows the comedy scene knows his name. So he passed the talent. He's passed away now. So
Oh,
I
so,
feel
so
like
name him. Just say who he was, this asshole.
Lucian was his name that everyone knew him by.
Right.
So yeah, he was well known, but he was the kind of I kept thinking like he passed Jerry Seinfeld, he passed all these guys who got to get up and work out there, and
So you think
I
Seinfeld gave him a blowjob?
I don't think so.
Larry David maybe gave him a
It
Hummer?
probably never came up.
Came up. But
Bum, 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 bum.
so
But
so
at the same time, I was a lot of other people were very supportive, and Manhattan Punchline, and then but I did find it much more satisfying, and I could do a full one woman show. So I started moving in that direction, so that I could do my comedy, but not have to the
you
aggressive
moved
sort of
away from the erection towards that
yeah,
direction. That's
away from having to be too dependent on men to pass you. But
well, actually, do you have any stories about Sammy or Mitzi Shore? Because they're
I went there once and auditioned, and I must say it was a little overwhelming that night, and I didn't quite, as I got better at it and I could go up anywhere and do it, I didn't do as well as at the improv, and it didn't quite fit for me. So again, it was another. And then I did get a job in publishing, which I loved, and so I was very happy working full time in publishing and doing comedy when I could, and I would write these one woman shows. But that's brought me to do the 7.5 Habits of Highly Effective Mistresses, because was working at Random House, and I was so fascinated how books like 7 Habits of Highly Effective People had become these major hits with, sort of simple life advice. And so I thought, well, this would be fun to do a parody of this kind of book.
right.
And I told my friend who was a lawyer at Random House, I was thinking of doing this title, 7.5 Habits of Highly Effective Mistresses. And he said, well, you can't copyright a title, but you can trademark a title. So you might want to be careful. But I ended up doing the show in, downtown and uptown in different cabaret clubs, and it was quite fun. I had a wonderful pianist friend, Ellen Mandel, a great composer,
She's
and
been on
we.
this program
Oh, she has. I love Ellen. We're
with
very
Michael
close
Lydon,
still.
her husband.
Michael Lydon, yeah. So we would get together, and she lives near me in the East Village, and first I chose songs that were love songs, and I was going to weave a story around that. But then we had so much fun, we started writing original songs. So like How to Be a Bad Girl, we wrote, and it was super fun for us. And she's smart and would throw in great ideas. And it was very much like a presentation. So I had a flip chart, and then my sister was taking writing lessons, so she had a writing crop and she'd stopped. So I said, could I use this? It'd be funny to use it as a pointer, on the PowerPoint and flip the chart and like whack it. So she said, sure, sure, you can take it. But then it was funny because I hadn't quite realized with the title, people thought it maybe was an S&M show, like a dominatrix mistress. So it was meant to be. I had a brief affair with a married man, and when I ended it, I had told a friend, and she was like, I had an affair with a married man. I told another friend, I had an affair with a married man. So I thought, wow, it's an interesting topic that's not talked about. So that's had brought me to the trying it. But then as we found, there was a whole interest in bondage, and my neighbor actually, who was a lovely woman, who had wanted to be a dominatrix, so she was telling me the ins and outs, and she would come and be our stage manager and house manager, and it was very funny because so she would sort of scold people when they came in and made them sit down, and so little by little we began to work a little of that in, just like if you heckled me, I'd pull out the writing crop, and then at one point I always wanted to do sing-alongs just to get the audience involved. So we did a sing-along of Diamonds Are a Girl's Best Friend. And we tried to, as we got everyone to sing, then of course there'd always be some poor man in the front row who wasn't singing. So Ellen Mandel actually, her title was Mistress Ethel, after, Lucy and Ethel. And so she would get up from the piano. First she'd play, ominous chords, and then she'd get up and go down to punish the man in the audience who wasn't singing. And she would like pull back the whip, and I would jump in front of her. No, he's learned, he'll sing now. So then we'd, get him to sing. So it was a lot of fun. And then we did so well with it. We took it to the Edinburgh Fringe Festival, and we went to the Washington, D.C. Capitol Fringe Festival, they call it. But after that, I was sued by the Franklin Covey Corporation, owner of the trademark 7 Habits of Highly Effective People. So it was frustrating because they hadn't seen the show clearly. I mean, it was really pretty tame and funny, but in the lawsuit, it was quite scary. I was served this big lawsuit, and one of the great lines in it says, Phillips has tied the 7 Habits brand with unsavory topics such as sexual bondage, bestiality, and what she refers to as, quote, the fellatio tango, unquote. Now, I had to say guilty as charged,
That's certainly a mouthful.
But
yeah, all right. But wait a minute. You could do what you want with a title, but did your verbiage on posters and things look like the font and the typeface of the book of the 7 Habits of Effective whatever?
Yeah. So, and I actually mocked up a book on stage that looked like their book. So, with the good thing, and I joke,
here's lawsuit, or did you pay? What happened?
Well, it was funny how it worked out, because I joke in the show now that fortunately I have a thing for Jewish lawyers. So my 23 lawyers said I could get off based on First Amendment, I could win based on First Amendment freedom of speech, but it would be expensive. But, the reality was I had 3 Jewish lawyer boyfriends, a former and one current, and he was very helpful, and he was at a big law firm. He called them and he negotiated that I wouldn't, they would stop the lawsuit. I had to stop doing the show, but I have a permanent injunction against me in Utah because they're Mormons. So I thought that was very funny, little twist. So they filed the original lawsuit in Utah. So my lawyer said that if I were to use the title again, then they could take me right back to court. Is basically, they didn't have to do all the initial filings. And but in the end, I said, can I use 8.5? He's like, no, stay away from numbers.
But what I did do, you can do your Gershwin show in Utah. They don't have
exactly.
Right.
Well, and then of course I couldn't resist doing a show, and I took it to the Washington D.C. Fringe Festival that was called How I Was Sued for the 7.5 Habits of Highly Effective Mistresses.
Which you could.
I can refer to the show name if referring to the lawsuit. What? So I milked that for a show.
Jewish lawyers. Gotta love the intricacies of these things. It's amazing. But we can actually get into the whole thing of, so you admitted that you had at least one, I mean, all your many dalliances, you beautiful whore, Did you feel guilty that you were, with someone like a ring on it?
Yes, I did. I did feel guilty, and and that what eventually ended it. And so it was a lesson. Sometimes I think you maybe learn when you're young. He was someone I worked for. Sort of I fell into that. But yeah, so I did learn a lesson there, and I've warned other people, don't do it.
So that was the only time in your whole
Yeah, yeah,
list
yeah.
of many,
Fortunately,
many,
I
many,
think.
many, 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 many fellatios and whatever else.
Yeah, exactly. With
Well,
non-married men.
married ones. Okay, fine, fine.
But
Now,
it was interesting then with I had gotten so with the election situation 4 5 years ago, I guess, when I was working oddly enough, I'd been in publishing, but I got a wonderful job at the Council on Foreign Relations, working
what
doing the
kind of relations?
I
No.
know exactly. That's what I said. Their magazine, Foreign Affairs. I was like, oh, what kind of affairs you got here? But it was fascinating because I helped them build their new website, and this, they have a great many talks that are fascinating. If you're interested in those topics, you can go on their website and watch very interesting topics and talks from the experts. But while I was working there, I had always been interested in politics, but that particular time I got very, aware, even more aware. And when the elections were coming up, I was concerned, I wanted to get people out, positive energy. And so we did initially basically a fundraiser gave the money to Common Cause, and it was called Make America Laugh and Sing Again. So it was so fun, and I had different singers and comedians come together, and we sold out, and it was a very happy occasion. And this was pre-COVID, so I thought, oh, I'll do this every month as a fun thing, getting people out, getting people involved. Never mentioned the orange evil, and
Because he
and
probably trademarked the red hat with the thing of "Make
yeah.
America Sue You." Right? Yeah.
And so then COVID hit. So everything stopped. But I went on and did I did a little podcasting with this one foundation, helped them with that. And then when COVID started lifting, I really felt a passion to try to keep these clubs alive in the East Village because they were so badly hit, performers and clubs. So I started again doing the Make America Laugh and Sing show at Pangea, a wonderful place that's been there, 30 years. And it was interesting as I thought about other shows, I was thinking I wanted to do a show about a composer because I always loved the American Songbook and I love reading the biographies. Have the biographies, and then I listened to the audiobooks of the biographies. So I thought, what a fun topic for me that I already am fascinated by. And it was interesting. I take classes on and off at Juilliard, and so took a class with this wonderful Ed Barnes who teaches there, and he did a short class on Fred and Adele Astaire, and it was so interesting because I had known a little about them, but he described how when Fred was young, 14 years old, he was looking for songs, and he was going along Tin Pan Alley and went into Remix, and there he met George Gershwin, who was a song plugger. George had quit school at 15 to become a song plugger. They hit it off, and Fred said they'd love to one day do a Broadway musical, he and Adele. And George said, well, I'll write one for you. And sure enough, 10 years later in 1924, they wrote Lady Be Good, and it changed the Broadway musical. So I thought, wasn't that interesting? So I read a big biography of the Astaire's, and in that there are 14 existing letters from Adele Astaire to George describing her great love for him. So as I read those letters, I thought,
Her
what?
great love for.
George Gershwin.
Oh,
Yeah.
yeah, got. Yeah, right, yeah.
Yeah, so it was so fascinating because the love letters they build up from like 23, 24, and then she's in Lady Be Good, and then he clearly comes to London to launch Lady Be Good, the opening for Lady Be Good in London, and she writes him a most moving letter. Oh, you've just left me. Oh, I adore you, George. Think of me often, and it ends with I adore you, Adele. And it was so amazing to read those letters. Unfortunately, none of the letters exist from him to her, but it just made me think, wow, what a fun angle. You talk about George's love life, with these great love songs, which I'd always loved. And reading more, I was reading how,
Wait.
Ira was the
Tell us,
shot.
like, in your show, right? What are a song or two that were Adele related?
With The Man I Love, they gave that to Adele to sing in Lady Be Good. and they said she did a beautiful version, but it was cut in Philadelphia because it was seen as bringing the show down. They wanted to have it more upbeat, but it was such a beautiful song. And then interesting, Lady Mountbatten was visiting from London, and she heard George play it at a party, and she asked for an autograph copy, and then she took it back to London and gave it to her favorite dance band, and then it took off in London, Paris. Isn't it amazing?
Oh
So it
my
was
God.
fascinating. And
It
Ira
blew
would,
up just like Lord Mountbatten. No, I don't know about that.
yeah. And Ira would watch George. Ira was the shy one who often would go to the parties, but would sort of sit in the corner, but he kept a diary. So Ira wrote down a lot of George's romances. And then
Oh,
Ira, of course, wrote the lyrics. So it's particularly wonderful when you see, how these songs were evolving around
right.
George's
So who
marriage.
else? Who
Well,
else?
of course, he had then, George was seriously involved with Pauline Heifetz, Yasha Heifetz's sister, in 1924.
He wasn't just fiddling around with her.
That's right. That was serious, and they just dated, very properly because she would have been a woman he could marry. But in the end, they went to a party at Kay Swift and her husband James Warburg's beautiful double wide townhouse on East 70th Street. And after that, Pauline wrote in her diary that went to party at Warburg's. George leaves for Europe, and then a skull and crossbones next to the entry, and it said finita, really, in big letters. So I pondered, did she see the attraction between George and Kay Swift? Because shortly after that, George started a 10-year affair with the composer Kay Swift.
Wow.
And hmm,
She moved
and
in
though he
swiftly, if you
continued
will. Yeah, yeah. Wow, wow, wow.
Although he continued dating Pauline, by the next year she was proposed to by a Samuel Chatsanoff, who was a pianist and went on to become the musical director at NBC. And she sent George a telegram and asked if she should marry Schatzi, as they called him, and George said yes. Hmm. But
So what was? Do we sense that there are songs that George wrote for K Swift that like?
Yes, we do. We do. And it's interesting. You may also know the next show he did, the next big show was OK, which was originally called Mayfair and it was written for Gertrude Lawrence, but he changed it to OK, Kay exclamation mark, and the main character was named Kay, and this is when Kay had become the main woman in his life.
Did her
Weirdly,
husband have no clue?
well, no, sadly, he did begin to know. And he was, well, oddly, in the musical OK, the romantic lead's name was Jimmy, as was her husband's name, which was weird. Well, then, it's interesting because George also inspired Kay. She trained at the Institute of Musical Studies, which later became Juilliard. And so she was a serious, she'd done orchestration, harmony, so she really helped George with a lot of his orchestrations. But he also helped her to look at musical theater for the first time. And she ended up writing songs with her husband as her lyricist. So James Warburg of the great banking family wrote under Paul James, and they wrote Can't We Be Friends, one of the great songs about a marriage falling apart, when their marriage was falling apart. And they also wrote together Fine and Dandy, the first full musical on Broadway composed by a woman. It was written, the lyrics by her husband. And that ran for, 300 performances. Isn't that amazing?
It's such an incestuous business, but also
Yeah.
so amazing. Amazing. So who else? Who else did George Gershwin stop? And
Well, it was interesting. He did have a serious romance with a cousin. He really enjoyed the company of Emily Paley, who was a wife of a good friend, where they would socialize a lot, and where he met people like the Groucho Marx and the Marx Brothers and Fanny Bryce. But her sister, Leonore Gershwin, had a crush on George, but George wasn't interested, and so Leonore married Ira. So Lee Gershwin. So it's very incestuous.
oh my God, it's amazing that children have like five heads. All right, yeah.
And they all, for a while, when they had their initial financial success, they bought a townhouse on West End, and on Riverside Drive at the corner. And and Rose and Morris, the parents, lived on the second floor. The second two kids, Arthur and Francis, lived on the third floor. Lee and Ira, as a new couple, lived on the fourth floor, and George on the fifth floor. So
That's an
And
interesting lunchtime. Just
yeah, so they
eating
were all
together.
quite close. I think George enjoyed probably having all these women also taking care of him because they said he really wanted to marry, but the problem seemed to be he was always looking for the perfect woman, the perfect hostess, musical, artistic. So he had a hard time finally, ever settling for just one. But one he really seriously considered was Rosamond Walling, who was a cousin of the Paleys, and she was a student at Swarthmore, and he met her through the Paleys, and so they dated. It sounds like chastely, but they both loved art. She was quite a good artist and painter, and he was painting a lot at that time and had a very growing collection of great French, especially artists. And so she said she almost married him when he moved to his own penthouse on Riverside Drive, and he told her they could have this apartment below as a studio. But then she said that she found that the apartment was very Art Deco, and she said she didn't like the very fancy decorating, but it was decorated by Kay Swift. So his lover was decorating his new apartment.
Yeah, maybe that's why she didn't like the.
Wait, maybe she had an
But
inkling that was going on. And she said she didn't also like his idea of what marriage would be. He wanted to get married and have 4 children and live in Greenwich, which was somewhat Kay's life. They had a big Greenwich
oh,
estate where he often went. So,
mm,
and Rosamond was from a well-to-do family in Westchester, but she didn't want to go back to that life. She eventually married another painter and had a very successful painting career.
oh,
So
yeah,
that was
I thought
fascinating.
I read
So
somewhere that. I'm sorry. What? Yeah.
you go ahead.
No, I thought also did I read somewhere that he and Paulette Goddard were a thing?
That was his last great love.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
When he moved out to LA to work for the movies, sadly after the well, one little side story is, with when he was working on Porgy and Bess, the wonderful singer Anne Brown, who would come over to his apartment and work with him on the Bess character, and it really grew, and she would sing the new pieces, and she asked could he give her something to do with summertime, so he rewrote it for her to sing it, and he told her that he was changing the show. Initially, it was called Porgy, but it was changed to Porgy and Bess as her part really grew. And but she describes how she would go over, he'd play his new songs for her, and then they'd have lunch, and then he'd invite her into his bed. But she never went. She never went, she said.
Yeah, and she never strapped on the old knee pads, huh?
Yeah. And then she said after he made that invitation, he'd play the full, opera again, and they'd sing and he'd sing. And she said he just loved his music. It was his baby. It was very touching. But then, surprisingly for most people when they come to see the show is I talked briefly about how Porgy and Bess was a financial disaster and losing the equivalent of $2 million in today's money. And George had invested his own money.
Never
So
put your own money in.
no, don't never, as they say on the producers, don't put your own money. So he felt, he had to make some more money because he'd been doing very well financially. But so they looked for a Hollywood contract. And unfortunately, suddenly Hollywood studio executive said, now you're seen as too highbrow after doing an opera. But fortunately, then they got a contract to do Shall We Dance with Fred Astaire and Ginger Rogers. So
Uh-huh.
they went out to Hollywood, and interestingly, reading about Fred tells how he first met Ginger when they were doing George's musical Girl Crazy on Broadway. Ginger was cast as the lead at just, 19 years old. And so she was working on the songs, but the producers found the dances weren't very good. So they asked Fred, who was working at a Ziegfeld Folly next door, to come over and do some more choreographing for them. So Fred took Ginger out into the lobby of the theater, the only place he could find to show her the new dance steps. So they actually hit it off quite early, and they dated for a while. And Ginger describes in her memoir that Fred invited her out and they went dinner and dancing, and he drove her home to her rented apartment on Central Park West in his chauffeured Rolls Royce, because by then Fred was doing very well, and she describes their kisses as they would not have passed the Hayes production code.
Whoa! Because we don't think of Astaire as being,
I know.
oh, good for him. Yeah.
Yeah. And
Whoa.
so she said they thought their relationship, sure, she thought the relationship could grow into something more, but she'd been already signed by Paramount to go out to Hollywood, so she had to leave as soon as Girl Crazy closed. So she describes meeting Fred 3 years later, on the set of Flying to Rio. But she describes how she felt like she didn't know him. He had totally changed. And when they talked, he said it was because he was married now. And so she describes how on the set of their movies, his wife would come and sit in the corner and knit loudly and give Ginger the stink eye. And Ginger believes there were no love scenes between Fred and Ginger in those movies. There was only dancing. So she thinks the wife had something to do with that.
Fair enough. Well, okay, it wasn't like George just going off with anybody he felt like.
Yeah, exactly. Fred was stayed with his wife, and George then dated Ginger as well because he was dating, and he describes in a letter he dated Louise Rainier. And it was interesting in the letter he says that although she was German, she was pretending to be Austrian because of the growing, problem in Germany. So, but it was fascinating. He said
Yeah.
he loved he would go out with a lot of movie stars, but he said ultimately when they leave you feeling empty. But then at a party at Edward G. Robinson's,
Oh,
Mrs.
yeah.
Robinson sat him next to Paulette Goddard, and he was totally enamored of Paulette Goddard right away. Just found her fascinating and charming, and wanted to spend more time with her. And so she would come over. George, Ira, and Lee had rented a lovely house in Beverly Hills, and so they had a swimming pool and tennis courts. So Paulette would come over, and Oscar Levant describes that Paulette would not wear any underwear under her shorts, and she would flash George as they sat by the swimming pool, making George very agitated. But there's even home movies. Amazingly, on YouTube, there's a short bit of home movies that Ira shot of a lot of his friends, Harold Arlen, hanging around the pool. And there you can see Paulette Goddard looking beautiful and smiling with George.
I'm going,
But as
surprise!
but as you know, I'm sure that Paulette was married to Charlie Chaplin.
Chaplin. Not at the time, or weren't they already? Because he was.
Well, what's funny about it is I was reading a lot about that, and they were living together for a while, and there was an outcry, from Hollywood that you have to be married. So they went on a trip to China, and said they'd married there, but they may never have actually married, but they were living as husband and wife. And he was grooming her to be the star of Modern Times, her first big part. So as much as she loved clearly George, and she admits she would sneak out and meet him, she wasn't going to leave Charlie at that time. And so George wrote to his mother that it didn't look like anything would happen with Paulette because she was married. But his mom wrote back, it'd be all right with her because she read that Paulette is Jewish. So that was great. Leave Charlie, marry George. But sadly, then, the one great thing that came out of that relationship was they wrote that wonderful song for her. They can't take that away from me, because they basically did have to stop, the way you wear your hat, the way you sing off key. It's such great lyrics. But that was inspired by his love for Paulette. And that was nominated for an Oscar, interestingly, but it didn't win. The song that won was Sweet Leilani, sung by Bing Crosby to the movie Waikiki Wedding. So
Oh, of course.
that memorable number.
Well, no, I mean, you've heard of Waikiki Wedding. It's not something you can hum the way the other. So was she Gershwin's last, or was he still tomcatting around with God knows?
Well, no, he by then, he was starting to get the bad headaches
Oh.
and was losing some coordination. So heartbreakingly, his last year in 1937, he had a number of health issues, and he was still. Paulette did come by, and she describes in one of her memoirs in one of the biographies that she tried to get in and see him more, but it sounds like Gershwin was rather controlling, and they didn't want people to see George probably not looking his best. But sadly, he was alone a lot of the end. He had a valet living with him, but they went in for a checkup, and unfortunately, he wouldn't let them do a spinal tap, which would have shown the brain tumor. And awkwardly,
Even if they
yeah, I
found.
mean, they probably couldn't have done anything. They say, those brain tumors, it was a fast growing one, but it was too bad that, they didn't know until the end. He went into a coma, and he went in and had surgery, and then they saw it and then tried to get get more help, but it was too late. So it was the end. Oh, but one of the other fascinating stories that I discovered was Kay Swift when she was dating George, and she loved her husband and she loved George and was in love with George. So she was torn by the deceit and the adultery, and so she started seeing a psychotherapist,
Oh, I
Dr.
thought you were seeing. All right. Yes. Yeah. Yeah.
Dr. Zilberg, what a great name.
Yeah.
And so it was her husband seeing him, and then George started seeing him. So it sounds very wrong because I'm sure, it sounds like Kay would.
And it's like I can't tell any of them.
Yeah, yeah. But then it turns out Zilberg would go, he went like on a cruise with George, and he literally would get all the men on board, like three men to talk to him. And then he would like make fun of them at breakfast over what they told him. So he did not sound like a good therapist. And Kay describes that, she would have been going probably talking about how she loved George and, loved her husband. So this psychiatrist was hearing all that. And Ira said that one of the problems for George with Kay was that she had three daughters, and he felt it would be a lot to, marry and take care of, be the father. But she was not Jewish, so Rose, George's mother, did not like that. But so George is probably saying all those things to Zilberg, but heartbreakingly, Kay told her granddaughter, and it was written in her granddaughter's memoir, that Zilberg made or had Kay have sex with him during their sessions. And she said she didn't want to, but she would, and then she would cry as she paid her bill. Can you imagine? And then when she wanted finally to leave her husband, Zilberg said, "Don't leave your husband. If you do, I'm going to tell both George and your husband all that you've told me." But she couldn't take it anymore, so she left Zilberg, and she left. Her husband went out to Reno and got a divorce. But can you imagine? And then at the end, Zilberg was still telling Lee Gershwin that George is a hypochondriac. He just wants attention. So, I mean, he played a really bad part in George's life.
The guy who was Brian Wilson's psychologist is like,
Yeah,
little
terrible.
nuts.
You
Jesus.
can't, you can't. That was bad to hear. But
Well,
yeah, and then of course when he died, the whole country mourned. I mean, he was such a beloved figure.
well, she's talking, but the person we're talking to is Lisa Faith Phillips, and she's talking about George Gershwin. She will be talking more about George Gershwin and singing many of his songs in her show, which is called Let's Do It Again, Songs and Love Affairs of George Gershwin, which you can go see on next Saturday, October 26th, 7 p.m. at the Club Pangea, which is over on 2nd Avenue and what is it?
Between 11th and 12th.
11th and 12th Street. You can get
And it's good to come early because they doors open at 6, and you can get food and drink, excellent food and drink there. And we do tend to sell out, so come early just so you can get a good seat and order your drink. And I do want to mention I have the great pleasure of Deanna Kirk, one of the great cabaret singers of all time, who had two of her own clubs, Deanna's, in New York City. She's singing with me, and she's just a delight. We get along so well. And so I'll sing some of the songs she sings, some and some we sing together, which is really great to build the sound. And we have a fabulous pianist, John DiMartino.
Oh, I have
And
a fabulous pianist, but
oh,
I can't
he's
show it up
just
in the area.
he's just amazing. He can listen when I was working with him, he would play the song and I'd practice the song, and then I'd work on the jokes or the stories, and I'd tell him some. He was fascinated because he didn't know most of these stories either, though he knew a lot of the songs. And then as we worked together, I said, "Well, here's the script, and are you going to follow along and then play the songs?" He said, "No, I'm just going to listen." And it's so amazing. He just listens to me tell the story. And so he plays under me the whole time, and he softens it when it needs to be, and then moves into the key to get ready for fascinating rhythm. And so it's just a joy to play with him. He's such a great pianist.
And
So
so
we have so much fun.
now I do want to say that this is happening on October 26th. Are you doing it again in November?
Well, I'm going to do my Cole Porter on November 30th. So Saturday, November 30th, I'm going to do Cole Porter, and that's super fun as well. And we'll definitely bring him back because everyone loves them, and just everyone wants to hear these songs. And then with the extra little bit of naughty stories, it makes it even more fun. And then we'll probably do Irving Berlin in the new year. So we're having super fun, and we're talking about taking them up to the Triad as well, just to
Oh,
be
yeah.
on the Upper West Side, so we can get people who live up there, because some people won't come down to the East Village. Who knew?
I won't come to the, except for Katz's. Katz's, which is a little lower down, I'll come for that. Let me ask you though, so before we let you go, speaking of naughty, one of your other shows was lessons learned from jobs I can never put on my resume. So what's a job that you wouldn't tell a potential employer, etc. And
Well,
so,
this also has a funny beginning. I was called right in the peak of COVID. I was called by a headhunter, and they were looking for someone to come on to be CEO of a new website funded by the Girl Scouts of America that was going to be targeted to older, 18 plus women who believed in those values and had been Girl Scouts. So as I talked to the head of the board, a wonderful woman, she liked me, and they started having me interview as go up the chain. And then I realized my background, I had these jobs that they might not approve of. So one of the first ones is to pay for graduate school at the London School of Economics. I worked as a stripper in Boston's combat zone. I had finished Wellesley College, and I actually went looking for a waitressing job, but I saw you could, make a lot more money working as a stripper. So
all right, well, yeah, again, there's still a stigma. Well, certainly the Girl
there's still a
Scouts,
stigma.
we have a stigma against stripping. I
Yes.
get this. Do you have any amazing stories from your months or however long it was as
Well,
a
it was fun. It
technical
was funny
specialist?
because when I got there, sadly, the year before, there'd been a Harvard student killed in one of the clubs. So they'd really cracked down. So they're trying to clean up the area. So some of the other dancers were very into, musical, comedy things. And one came out as a in the Pink Panther costume in a cage and would strip out of the Pink Panther. So it was a little more showy than it had been. So I had thought to myself, I had been in a production of cabaret where we made our own corsets and sewed on beads and sequins. So I did that. So I made this very cute pink corset with little beads and sequins and tassels. And then I was looking for a gimmick, and you got to have a gimmick.
Gimmick, yeah.
And I was in just walking by a big candy store near in their Faneuil Hall area, and there was a very large candy cane. So I bought it, and I put a big red bow on it, and I would lick it to the song Candy. So the audience loved it.
Oh yeah. Oh yeah. You and those skills there. That keeps
Yeah,
coming up as
it
a
was something I came naturally, and then of course one day I was going to go on stage, and I see one of my economics professors from Wellesley, and I'm like, uh-oh. But I thought, well, I can't hide. I've got to do my set. So I went up to him, and we had been quite close. He was one of my professors, so he thought it was great.
yeah, 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 yeah.
He kept coming back. He brought a religion professor. They came back and hung out all the time because they were like, well, we're friends with Lisa.
Different times, Lisa.
Different
So
times.
you left that off your resume for the Girl Scouts. What
Yeah.
else?
So and the
What's
other
another
one,
job?
I
That,
also,
yeah.
one of the other jobs I had was when I was first working, trying to do stand up and plays and writing plays. And a friend of mine said, well, they were looking for people to write phone sex scripts at Penthouse, some guy who worked at Penthouse. And I thought, well, that'd be easy to do. I could do that, and it paid well. So I called the guy who was running the phone sex lines. Remember when phone sex lines were popular? And he said, well, I have enough writers right now, but you have a nice voice. Would you want to be one of the voices? And so he said, come in and audition. So I went into Penthouse the next day, and it was very funny because of course I thought it'll be this fabulous studio. The guy hands me a bunch of wires, and he takes a reel to reel, and we go down to a little room off the cafeteria at Penthouse, and we set up this makeshift recording. And so he gave me a script, and it was pretty funny because it's like it's basically like 3 minutes, and then it ends with a lot of oohs, ahs, at the end.
Kind of like
And
my sermons. Yes.
yeah. So
Or
he
my
said,
books in the morning. Come to think of it, yes.
he says, read it over, and there's occasionally typos, make sure you. So I give it a quick practice, and I'm feeling nervous, like any audition, but this one in particular. And so then I start in, I'm like, oh, I'm a beautiful blonde, on the beach, and then I started, huffing and wheezing and sort of like high and sighing, and then I started getting dizzy, and I'm like, I think I'm going to pass out.
For real? Or you were actually?
For real. And I finished the piece, but then I think I'm going to pass out. He said, you got to get your breathing down, but it was so funny. But I got the job, and I could just go in, it was basically $50 a script. But if you were a good sight reader, you could do 10 scripts in, half an hour. So I could make about $500 an hour. So I went in there and I did that. And then even when I went to I got a job at Random House, and I would still try to go over there at lunchtime to make a little
Yeah.
extra money. But then I said I couldn't do it anymore because I was busy at Random House. So then I did write them for a while because that I could just write them and
50
drop off.
bucks, $500 a day. I should go
An
into
hour.
this.
If you're a good sight reader, if you have.
Oh, take it out. Take it out, God damn it. Oh, yeah. Oh, it looks like a mezuzah.
And it was all, recorded, so you didn't really have to. Sometimes I got to be that month's penthouse pet. I'd be like, turn to page 40. This is when I really got on with the cameraman. Oh,
Oh, wow. Wow. All right. It's so great that you're not ashamed of these things. A lot of people would be like, "Oh, you were forced to leave things off. What I take it you didn't get the Girl Scout job, or did
Well,
you?"
I admitted to the head of the board, and I just admitted one bad job. I admitted the stripper job, and she laughed and she said she thought it was funny, but I
Wow.
was right. The Girl Scouts would do a thorough investigation.
Yeah. Yeah. Wow.
The other last funny story that I do in that show is when I was putting up posters for the 7.5 Habits of Highly Effective Mistresses, just in the East Village. I'd been working with Ellen at her apartment. I left and, I just put a little one up where there was already posters, and on a construction site. And the police, undercover police pulled up and arrested me, handcuffed me, took me into Avenue D and 10th Street police station, which was very rough then. And and they said they're sorry, the one policeman who was very sweet, he's like, I'm really sorry we have to take you in. If it was above 96th Street, you could die on the sidewalk and nobody cares. But down below 96th Street, they want to make it look nice. Oh, thanks
So
for
when you
letting
were
me know.
arrested just for putting up posters, it wasn't
Yeah,
like
yeah.
you were an
It was
enforcer.
when Giuliani was mayor.
Yeah.
So they
Wow.
were cleaning up downtown, So, but it was amazing because then they put me in jail, and I was at that time vice president at Random House. So I was like, uh-oh, this is not so good.
So
But
you were arrested, but not even brought to trial. You didn't have
it
to.
was interesting. They booked me and fingerprinted me, and then they put me in jail. And they had to wait. In those days, they had like one bad computer, and they had to wait to send my information up to Albany to see if I was wanted in any other state. I say briefly, I wondered if I was wanted in another state, but then when they came back at like 4 in the morning and said I wasn't, wanted in any other state, they let me out. But officially, I had a misdemeanor, graffiti, materials to commit graffiti. So I did have a court date, but they dropped it. But it was very funny because then while I was in jail, all I was going to do was rehearse the show, and I had a show coming up. So I got up and I started singing and dancing in my cell. And the very cute, there were two policemen who arrested me. The older one, who was quite attractive, came running over and he's like, "Shh, they're going to think you're crazy." And so I felt like he cared, he really cared.
And you dated him for a period of time. No.
Well, it's funny. When we got out, we got out. They ended up saying, "Well, we'll drive you home." It's turned colder. It was February. It had been wildly mild earlier in the evening, and so they drove the wrong way up Second Avenue, which made me nervous, and dropped me off at my apartment. And I was thinking about wanting to ask Kevin, was his name, the cute older detective, and but I gave him a card for my show, and I said, you come to my show, and he said, "Oh, I'd love to, but that night we have to be on Graffiti Patrol."
How appropriate. Wow. Wow.
So I had
This.
a few reasons that the Girl Scouts probably wouldn't want to have
Yeah.
me as
Boy
CEO.
Scouts will have you in a second. You take 11-year-olds and turn them into 19-year-olds in about a minute and a half. It's like just bring out the candy cane. It's like, kids, this is not just for Christmas. Let me show what a woman does to this thing. Oh my God, ladies and gentlemen, we have been talking to Lisa Faith Phillips. We have faith in her that her show is going to be wonderful. Again, going to remind you that on October 26th, next Saturday night, 7 o'clock at Pangea, the club. It's called Let's Do It Again, Songs and Love Affairs of George Gershwin. You're going to get there early just to make sure it's not sold out. Tickets are, I think they're only like $20.
$20, and there is a $20 food and drink minimum, but they have great food there.
Right, so order food, have a nice night out. Remember also, if not that if you miss it, you got to see the Gershwin one, and then on November 30th, she'll be back at Pangaea doing a Cole Porter. What is the name of the Porter show, by the way?
The name of the show is Let's Fall in Love, the songs and loves of Cole Porter.
Let's fall in love. So if you ever do a Rabbi Sol Solomon show, it's like, let's get angry. The third one of the songs I've written, like, let's get angry at the world. And then you tell about all my love affairs, which are none. So anywho. Lisa,
well, thank you so much, Rabbi. This was great.
Yes, I wish you much, much mazel, shalom, and a love affair with art is what I really wish of you.
And singing and dancing.
Mit mazel.
Bye.
Shalom.